Hello, I'm Lauri Hennessey, and I'm the CEO of League of Education Voters. Welcome to Washington Game Changers. This is a one on one conversation with powerful leaders in a time when we need to hear about the good people who do good in this world. At League of Education Voters, we're committed to exposing and addressing all of the myriad ways in which we perpetuate institutional racism. We know we face systemic racism in our schools, housing, employment, healthcare, and more. Institutional racism impacts youth of color in our criminal justice system, from school punishment to our prison system. And we have so much to do to reform these systems. In the meantime, how do you make changes today and help even one child who's entering that pipeline? Choose 180 is doing that. That's why I'm honored to talk to my guest today, Sean Goode, the executive director of Choose 180. The organization is all about reducing the stream of youth that go into that system. And we're now working with Choose 180, both in our school to prison pipeline working group and also in an upcoming webinar that we'll be doing. We'll hear much more about them and others who are involved in this issue. But today, I want to talk about Choose 180. And I'll let Sean tell us more about that. Hi, Sean.
Hey, Lauri, thank you so much for the space and opportunity to share.
Well, it's great to talk to you. So I guess right off the top, tell us about Choose 180. What is it?
Well, we are a nonprofit organization that's actively working to dismantle systems of injustice while supporting the young people who are disproportionately harmed by those systems. It's a very intentional practice of both meeting the needs of young people in community as they actively present themselves, while being incredibly intentional at looking at the systems that are creating those needs and working within those systems and outside those systems to apply the necessary pressure and implement the necessary strategies to see them fall apart so we can build something new together, empowered by the collective us.
How does it work?
Yeah, great question. When our organization began in 2011, it was pretty simple. Our prosecutor-elect Dan Satterberg reached out to community leader Doug Wheeler and said that the prosecutor's office was failing our children. And because Dan Satterberg, the white prosecutor, said our as he was speaking about the Black and brown children of our community, Doug Wheeler, the community leader, leaned in and said, okay, let's build an alternative together. And back 10 years ago now, they created what at that time was called the 180 program, which essentially served as what's called a pre-filing diversion program, which basically means when young people live in neighborhoods that are overly policed and therefore their behavior is criminalized, police send those referrals to the prosecutor's office. But because of our relationship, instead of sending those referrals from prosecutor to the courtroom, it goes prosecutor back to community. And we have a chance to offer our young people community instead of a criminal conviction, and watch the way their lives turn around because of grace and not guilt.
So one thing I read about you is that there's this idea of wraparound services. And I think that's a phrase that people sort of can understand. Tell us how those wraparound services work. What are the arrays? What are the ways that you support a kid?
Yeah, I tend to think of ourselves as an emergency room. So we're able to engage young people at these critical moments, triage them, help them get well enough, and then identify primary care and specialty practitioners to help them sustain this commitment they've made to a new direction for their lives. And we call that their community of support. And so it really depends on the young person. I mean, some young people, they're looking for tutoring because they want to do better in school. Some young people are looking for jobs. Some young people are looking for therapy. Some young people are looking to overcome addiction. Some young people are looking for a house or are looking to get into housing. And the needs are as diverse as the population that we serve. And so we don't prescribe a one size fits all and say, here is the treatment that works for all young people. We believe that our way of engaging young people at critical moments and the treatment that we provide in those critical instances is important, but we believe it's simply a gateway to a variety of other services that we help curate based upon the young person's desires.
So I've been thinking a lot since we first connected about the phrase boys will be boys. Um, you know, I read something very powerful that you had said in some interview about this idea of teenagers and particularly boys. There's this wiring of the brain, and my husband shares all these stories about his teenage years. Everyone does, but boys will be boys isn't for everyone. I mean, some kids are going to be treated differently and always have been by our society when they do things that teenagers do. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's important that I was on a call yesterday with some folks and they were asking, well, How do you help people who think that the mantra of do the crime, do the time is actually the best way forward? And what I was explaining to them was that it's not actually helping people see something new. It's helping them see that something old actually applies to all young people. And historically, throughout our nation, we provided second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth chances to people who are reflective of the dominant culture, while Black, Indigenous, people of color are given a single shot, and given a single shot in an environment that's far less conducive to their dominant culture peers. And if they miss that shot, then there's a cascade of negative effects that come thereafter, right? Whether it's not succeeding well in high school, then not getting into college, not getting into post secondary, or getting suspended when you're in sixth grade or in elementary school, and how that turns into being suspended in middle and high school. How Black children, in particular, are aged 3 to 4 years older by appearance based upon implicit bias. And so you can have a 12-year-old sitting in a sixth grade classroom and the teacher is responding to them like they're a 16-year-old because of implicit bias. Right? There's a variety of different ways that inequality manifests itself when we're looking at supporting young people in their behavior, and whether or not we're actually listening to the behavior or whether we're criminalizing it. Candidly, young people from the dominant culture, when they have behavioral upticks, people listen, they lean in and say, well, what's going on here? When Black, Indigenous, people of color, our children have behavioral incidents, it's, well, how do we suppress the behavior and not listen to it? Every young person, when their behavior is speaking, deserves to be listened to. And how do we build in intentional pauses in our schools, in our criminal legal system, in our community, in all the places that we live and desire to thrive, to be able to truly listen to what a young person's behavior is saying, so we can hear and then respond based upon what their need is. And that's at the heart of our cause and at the heart of our conviction that we can and will decriminalize adolescent behavior.
How did you get into this work?
I was born into this work. I mean, my first engagement with the criminal legal system was as a 6-year-old boy visiting my brother who was locked up inside of a kid jail when he was 13. And that's the earliest memory I have of my brother. And the next memory I have of my brother isn't until he was a 21-year-old man. And work like ours didn't exist at that time. So there were no opportunities for young people to pause, pivot, and commit to a new direction. There simply was policing, courtrooms, and kid jails. And I'm in this work because I saw what it did to my brother's life. I see what it has done to my brother's life. I saw the positive impact my brother's life had on me when he was released, and how he helped me commit to a new direction for my life, and how his life was never a life that was beyond redemption. And that the 8 years of his childhood that he lost incarcerated inside of a kid jail were really unnecessary. That regardless of what happened that led to that incarceration, he was not a throwaway. He was not a menace. He was a young person whose behavior was speaking loudly and simply needed somebody to listen to what it was he was saying and respond to it appropriately and make sure that he got the right support so he could be what we see all young people as, which is a possibility to be developed and not a problem to be solved.
That possibility to be developed instead of problem to be solved is so pervasive in how
Yeah,
we see mistakes,
yeah.
um, especially in kids and especially in kids of color. I mean, do you see that as the society seems to be, and by society, I mean white society, as white society seems to be kind of coming out of some sort of deep slumber of realizing some of our presets that need changing in a long overdue fashion? Do you see anyone starting to acknowledge more that we really have unfairly been looking at those teenagers who make mistakes?
Well, if we look at it like an awakening,
Mhm.
I think at best we're in a place where white America is rubbing the crust out of their eyes. I don't think that we're at a place where we've quite made our way, where white America has made their way out of the bed, has kicked their feet over to the side, has even stretched and embraced the fact that there is indeed a new day. Ibram X. Kendi writes this incredible book called Stamped from the Beginning, where he talks about the difference between being racist ideas, an assimilationist, and an anti-racist. And I think that some of the delineation there is really profound because we know clearly if we say racist in our mind what the picture that's painted. But here in the Pacific Northwest in particular, I think we have a proliferation of assimilationists, which
Mhm.
are people who believe that what the goal is to get BIPOC children to perform at the standard of what whiteness is. And that's what success looks like. And so if we can get BIPOC children to perform to the standard of whiteness, then we get rid of, and then we can demonstrate that there isn't racism or implicit bias. That's assimilationism. That's just a shade different than racism because it's elevating the standard of whiteness as peak performance and everything else secondary to that. I think we need to get to a place where we acknowledge that all of our children and all of creation shows up differently based upon the culture and community that they come from. And how do we intentionally honor that and teach to that and support to that instead of funneling everybody through a white dominant cultured lens of success and aptitude? It's imperative that we move away from measuring performance based upon white standards, and then we begin to really honor young people as they are instead of as we think they should be based upon what's been put in front of us over and over again. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I thank you. And I've thought a lot about this lately with the whole framework of nonprofits in Seattle and how people who lead nonprofits oftentimes get those positions because of connections. And there's this whole idea of the connection-based culture and how who you know is what matters. And my entire career has been blessed by knowing people who were references to me who knew someone. And I've never looked at it with the eyes I look at it now. What that world's about. Of course, that's different than the world that teenagers face, but it just continues that cycle of being okay with saying, this is a problem. No, we need to do more than that. We need to actually say, how do we change it?
Yeah. And candidly, I think that in American culture, we have an obsession with problems anyhow, and that we are constantly orienting ourselves to everything based upon it being a problem. And I believe that's the case because problems are incredibly affirming because then we can come up with solutions. But when we get into problem solving mode and when we come up with solutions, then we ultimately create subsequent problems to then come up with follow up solutions. So we stay in this affirmation cycle that's deeply troubling. This is where elevating possibilities over problems requires innovation instead of duplication. And it requires us to begin to think outside of our traditional spaces, our traditional ways of being, our traditional top down methodologies, and begin to consider what is really present and what can we do to create new. And we absolutely need to create new. We don't need to solve old. We absolutely need to create what's new. There's no solving what's old. There's not a solution for that. That is what it is. But what can be is what we can create. And the power of the collective us, if we were to lean into that, huh, the sky's the limit.
So talking about that approach through Choose 180, I read something about not to go to this, well, maybe I'm going to go to this thing of using numbers and metrics, but it sounds like for anyone who questions this approach to actually creating change, you have that. You can show that using this approach is helping. Can you tell me something about how it works, what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, we one of the numbers that people often want to look at is, well, do young people who engage in your programming, do they stay away from the criminal legal system? Well, yes, like 90% of them don't re-engage within 12 months of participating in our program. That's a terrifically high number, but it really says really two things that are tied together yet incredibly independent of one another. It says, number one, young people didn't need their behavior criminalized in the first place in order to be able to receive the support that they're getting from our organization. And number two, if you lean in and you listen to what a young person is saying by their behavior and by their voice and offer grace instead of guilt, you can see the type of transformation happen that the criminal legal system hasn't been able to produce after hundreds of years of doing the same thing over and over and over again. And our model is successful because on two hands, we are from the community, we're reflective of the community. Out of our staff team, the majority of us are Black, Indigenous people of color. Our board is also primarily comprised of Black, Indigenous people of color. This is significant because the lens that we bring into this work is in line with the young people and young adults that we're serving in community and their families. And also, we are working closely with system partners who we don't always agree with, in effort to see them change and begin to respond to our community differently. This requires a unique type of grace, that we regularly talk about. It's important that we're extending this grace towards our families and young people. But if we don't extend that same grace to our prosecutor partners, our law enforcement, or court partners, then it's called favoritism, because that's what grace selectively applied is. And so, if we're going to offer true grace, which is the only transformative tool I believe we have in our belt, then it's going to require it to be equally applied. And we have found that to be a great agent of change, not just in the lives of young people, but also in these systems of injustice. But it is a slow walk. There is no quick path towards long lasting change. If my COVID diet has taught me anything, it's definitely taught me that in the moment of stress, you regress to the mean and you go back to making choices that are not in line with the way you see your best self or in a swimsuit. I digress.
Speaking of COVID, how have we seen COVID in terms of the impact on the youth in communities that we work with? I mean, I just keep imagining the impact on families in terms of mental health, in terms of kids just making bad choices. I mean, this is so much to ask of kids to deal with. Have you seen some, to use the moments of grace? Have you seen some people really living into finding possibility in this terrible time?
Well, in the beginning of the pandemic, I had a chance to speak to some educators, and they were wondering about what is the way forward. And I said, well, if you want to know the way forward, then you listen to the young people who you've been serving, because it is a privilege to call this an uncertain time. Because many of the young people that we've been supporting in community, all they've known is uncertainty. And the type of resilience that you develop navigating one uncertain moment to the next, whether that's uncertainty around what you're going to eat for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or whether that's uncertainty on where you're going to live or your safety walking home. And when you live in the midst of that type of insecurity and instability, when you are forced to deal with something like COVID, it just is another thing. And for young people who grew up the way that I grew up, we are perfectly positioned to navigate moments like this and come out on the other side and still be willing to push forward and progress into what's possible. What that requires, though, is to have other people who are willing to dream alongside you. So that way you don't get sucked into the narrative of what can't be, and you still believe in what can be. And whether it's COVID, whether it's disproportionate rates of incarceration, whether it's disparities in hospitalization and medical care and medical treatment, whether it's lack of equal employment opportunities, whether it's lack of home ownership, whether it's disproportionate banking practices, the list goes on and on. And so COVID is just another thing on a very long list of of harm that's been caused to BIPOC communities in a disproportionate way. And we are still here, and we are still resilient. And when we lean on the collective us, there's nothing that we can't make it through together. But I will tell you, there's been different challenges. I mean, we went from spending a lot of time with young people to also to pivoting virtually, and then we went to resourcing young people's extracurricular stuff to helping pay rent and utilities, right? So our focus has shifted, our way of being has shifted, but our stubborn insistence that young people are possibilities and that we impart that to them as a way for them to see their future, that resolve has gone unchanged.
Do you have ideas about, there are a lot of parents right now who I know are looking for ways they can be part of community, be part of supporting community, volunteer somewhere. Um, I there's so many ways that have been shut down because of COVID, but I know that there are people who are hungry to do something to help in some way during this time. Where do you usually send people if they make that phone call to Choose 180 and say, I want to help, I want to do something? What do you tell folks?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to help. The first thing I'll say is start at home in your neighborhood and the people who live directly around you. One of the greatest barriers we have to public safety being re envisioned is a fear towards each other. Our simple fear of each other, our neighbors, our fellow community members, the people who are at the grocery store, the folks who we won't make eye contact with, the people who you move to the other side of the street when you're walking, not just because you want to stay 6 feet away and they may not have a mask on, right? There's a variety of ways it shows up. But the fear that we have of each other, that palatable, unnecessary fear, is the biggest stumbling block that we have towards becoming a community that really honors the humanity in all. So I first tell people, consider who you're surrounded with day in and day out, and ask yourself the question: how often are you leaning in with fear that's based on what you don't know, or curiosity based on what you desire to hold? And how often are you seeing people in their full humanity? And how often are you seeing them as objects that are getting in the way of wherever it is that you desire to go? If you can't do that at home, and you can't do that in your immediate neighborhood, then how are you going to come to someone else's neighborhood, someone else's home, and begin to do that there? Now, if we start there with the baseline, then the second thing I ask people to do is follow us on social media and help advance the narratives that we're putting out there. Help advance the things that we're advocating for. Call in to your local electeds and help them understand that young people are possibilities and not problems. And so they need to vote for legislation that honors that commitment. Your voice as part of the collective us is absolutely transformative. We often do a good job of voting people into office, but then we do a horrible job of holding them accountable once they're in office. You know, it's kind of like sending somebody to the grocery store to get groceries, and then when they show up with the groceries, like the food's just going to make itself, right? Like, no, that you actually have to do something to make that food turn into something that you eat for dinner in most cases. And our electeds are not microwave meals, and it requires all hands on deck to curate something that we're all going to be able to enjoy together. So get active in your local politics by knowing who your electeds are and holding them accountable to the things that you value and the things that organizations like ours value. And then support financially. You know, it's imperative that you resource organizations like ours by decolonizing your spending habits. You know, look at the way you spend your money currently. And how can you divert some of those resources into Black, Indigenous, people of color led organizations that are on the ground doing the work day in and day out that you may not have the ability to do because of whatever may be in the way. And so those are things that I'd advise. Love your neighbor. I know it sounds cliche and maybe a little biblical, but it's true, right? Like, love your neighbor, understand their shared humanity, stop being afraid of each other. Vote, but once you vote, make sure you hold electeds accountable to doing what it is they promised to do when they asked for your vote, and lean in. Lean in with your time, treasure, and talent to organizations like ours, because those resources, whether it's connections or dollars or unique skill sets, can be transformative. And we welcome them all.
How do you stay inspired in this work? I've heard you talk a couple times now, and you inspire me. How do you stay inspired?
Well, you know, I have a 19-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter, who I'm stubbornly refusing to welcome into a world that looks just like the one we're living in today. You know, when my son is my age, I don't want him to be working through the same challenges that are presenting themselves right now.
Mm-hmm.
And when my daughter is my age, I don't want her to live into a world that sees her any less than any man because of the work that I failed to do today. Um, I don't want either of their friends who are non binary to live in a world where their identity isn't honored by all. Um, because of that, it behooves me to show up every day and work as hard as I can. And I'm balanced out by an incredible wife who constantly reminds me that there's only so much that I can do. And at the end of the day, if I've poured out all that I have, then that's all that I have to pour. And so my family keeps me inspired and keeps me lifted up. And in earnest, conversations like this and folks who lean in and say we'd like to hear more are really catalytic moments for me that push me forward to believe that there's an opportunity for not just these thoughts and these ideas to go out, but for people to really begin to lean in and understand that there is hope in the midst of all of this. That in this time of great division, there is opportunity that we can lean into and possibilities that we can create.
So, schools. That's all I have to say. Schools. Um, any advice from your perspective, just in either as a parent or in the work that you do? It just feels like our schools are an area where we're so there's so much we could do to make schools more accessible for all, to even the experience, particularly around some of the detention and school resource officers. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but with very little time, what would you say your thoughts have been sort of watching the systems that we have around us?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago they put a rover on Mars,
Mhm.
right? And I am on my cell phone last week, I believe, looking at video on Mars. They got that rover there not by horseback. It wasn't even by a Model T Ford. That they have had innovations after innovations to figure out how you get a device to a planet far, far away to capture video images that then can show up to my phone. A phone that's not connected to wires, a phone that I keep in my pocket that I take with me wherever I go, a phone that I don't have to dial O for operator first to be able to get connected to a friend, a phone that does more in itself in its small package than these huge computers I had as a child. Now, how is it that we're able to do that? It's because at a certain point, we weren't stubbornly insistent on living into the patterns of our past because we had a vision of what could be in our future. And we were willing to abandon what was, leverage the learning that came from it, and create something new to get someplace that we've never been before. In our educational system, we are still operating in methodologies from an agrarian culture that applies to a very few people in our country. Yet and still, we continue to educate in a one size fits all type of manner. Why? The only reason why we would do it is because it benefits some. And those that it benefits are those who are quickly becoming the minority in our country. My ask is how long will we go before we envision Mars for our educational system? Before we envision a cell phone for our educational system? What is the next innovation that actually creates equitable access to learning for all of our young people, regardless of what their learning style is? So that way we can get them equipped with what they need and what they want and what they desire to become who they've been purposed to be, instead of asking them to wear the same old pair of shoes that generations in the past have worn. I tell you, the tread is worn out and it's tired and it's old and it's not effective. We have to stop doing what it is we've always done. But that's going to require, again, the collective us. It's going to require voters. It's going to require a mobilizing of voices. It's going to require a majority to push past our insecurity and say, well, we have to do these things. We have to teach these ways. We don't. We aren't reliant upon our past to inform our future in that way. No. The only thing that can determine the direction we're going is how far we're willing to see and the possibilities we're willing to create. And there's so much more for us there. In our
Yeah.
current educational system, I'll say this quickly, and then and we're nowhere near short on time. In our current educational system, we prioritize a young person's ability to listen and regurgitate what it is that they've heard. And we don't prioritize their ability to innovate and create beyond their circumstances. We don't prioritize possibilities, we prioritize problem solving. There's so far we can go, but yet we're so hindered by our limitation and our willingness to explore what can be. We can do that together though, but it has to be the collective us.
Wow. So much to think about. And I love talking to you. I wish I could do this again. Let's just continue doing this all the time. um, what do people do if they want to support Choose 180? Where do they want to go?
Yeah, you can follow us on social media at I Choose 180 or visit us at our website at choose180.org. That's choose, the word, the number is 180.org. And even if you don't do either of those things, you can immediately support our work by simply engaging with people who are in your immediate community and leaning in with love and grace and not fear and guilt.
So, last question for you. Any quote that means a lot to you, or a book that means a lot to you that you'd recommend? Any last thing that you would give someone as a recommendation from Sean?
Um, yeah. I will tell you that um, Cast is a book that I've read this year that's provided language around the racist history of our country. That's been really helpful. And I will tell you, the Stamp from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi is also another great read that helps provide some foundational understanding of how we are, where we are. Those are two books that really stand out to me.
That's great. All right, Sean. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do. And for everyone else, stay tuned for Washington Game Changers. My next interview is going to be with Estela Ortega from El Centro de la Raza. And stay tuned for that. You can be following us on our social channels, and we'll be keeping you posted on the next interview coming up. Thanks again, Sean. It's so great talking to you.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.